Hey folks, some people ask, why is it that I put so little value in scholarly consensus, particularly in the field of religious studies? I get pushback sometimes from those who say, what are your credentials? As a side note, I've been intentionally vague about that for a couple of reasons. The main one, for our purposes here, is that the way I evaluate evidence, the way you should evaluate evidence, is independent of my background, and it should be independent of your background. Our backgrounds are, for the most part, irrelevant. Imagine we're a jury or even a judge, and we're charged with being the fact finder, as any judge or jury impaneled, hundreds, thousands, millions of times, I don't know, a day around the country is charged with doing. The task would be to look at the evidence and make a determination from that evidence, weigh the credibility of the evidence, perhaps the people who are offering it. Is there a bias? Are they telling the truth? Are they hiding things from you? Is that stuff they're talking about real, tangible? For a good chunk of that, you wouldn't need to have a background on the subject to make such calls. And if such expertise was even necessary, you could turn to someone knowledgeable in the field to help you perhaps understand the technical stuff that you might not. This happens every day around the country. Again, I once sat on a grand jury, and the case was about drug trafficking, not an area I know anything about, maybe to your surprise. But we had experts explain things to us, like how drugs are trafficked, etc. What they didn't try to do was tell us what the evidence we had was. In this case, a few bricks of cocaine. They didn't try to tell us that it was or wasn't there, or that it was or wasn't real. We saw it, we touched it, and our job was to determine, given that evidence, whether it fit with the facts that the prosecutors were trying to put together as their total case. Did we believe the defendant testimony? Did we believe the officers? Were things lining up, etc.? But the evidence was the evidence. And so imagine now that you're sitting on a jury, and you're being tasked with answering the charge, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? And to that end, you're given a verse from Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, which reads, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." All right. So just to be complete, I will put the related passages from Mark and Luke. So the related passage in Mark is Mark chapter 9, verse 1, and it reads, "And Jesus was saying to them, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." All right, so that's Mark. And then to wrap it up, there's Luke chapter 9, verse 27, which says, "But I say to you truthfully, there are some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." All right, so that's Luke. So now you're told this was a prophecy and it ended up failing. Aha, this proves that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic preacher. And so you're like, okay, fine. Now give me the evidence for why that's true. And with that, we're going to kick off a video here where I'm going to walk through some presentations by scholars in the field of religious studies from a variety of backgrounds. And I'm going to leave it to you to tell me, one, did you need background in the subject matter in order to understand the arguments that are being put forth? And two, how compelling, cumulatively, is the case that's being made here? All right, but before we dive in, I'm just going to ask you guys, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. This channel is starting to grow, and I really do appreciate all the people who've subbed, but a lot of you have not, and it helps in so many ways if you just click that like button, click the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, and it helps me out a great deal. All right, thanks, guys. Okay, we'll kick things off with this video from Professor Mark Goodacre. I've shown clips of this before in another video, but I think for the most part, it speaks for itself.
Not the question. The question is, why does Mark tell you that story? There's plenty of other things that he could, talk about. So you constantly have this thing. And then Mark 13 focused big time on the temple, this big apocalyptic drama. So Mark, I think, is written in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, and it's actually trying to bring the Jesus story into the present, Mark's present in the 70s, and actually explain how it is that they've got to this kind of situation. But what becomes interesting about Matthew and Luke is that they pick up that obsession with the temple as well. And if anything, they go even further. Mm-hmm. And I mean, particularly when you look at the way that Luke writes up Mark 13, when Luke writes it up in Luke 21, he's even more specific about details of the destruction of Jerusalem. And really that's one of the ways that you deal with prophecy in the ancient world. It's about when prophecy is successful. And I can explain that with an analogy.
All right, so let's set the table here. So Professor Goodacre is talking about prophecy, and he's referring right now to the Gospel of Mark. Professor Goodacre is a Markan prioritist. Talks about this a lot. I'm not going to talk about that issue here. But he's framed this issue with respect to Mark and prophecy, and he's talking about why what he characterizes as prophecy appears in the Gospel of Mark at all.
Analogy. I saw a really terrible documentary on Channel 5 UK once, really terrible documentary, and it was called The Man Who Painted 9/11, and it was all about a guy that does prophetic painting. And one of his paintings, I think in the 1990s or something, was of a plane hitting the Twin Towers. And people go, wow, look at that, this guy prophesied it. Now, the reason why that guy was on that documentary is because 9/11 happened. If 9/11 hadn't happened, that guy would not be on the documentary with that picture of the Twin Towers, right?
Right.
So whether or not Jesus predicted the fall of the temple, the point is that it's in the texts because the authors of those texts want to say, look, Jesus prophesied it, and it came true. That's the function.
So we've discussed this before. Professor Goodacre is arguing that the so-called prophecies in Mark, the prophecy specifically regarding the destruction of the temple, was put in there because the author of Mark wanted the readers to know that Jesus had prophesied it. So Professor Goodacre's argument is that it's in the text because it has already happened. We've talked about this before, but this is a really important point for this point in the video, because what Professor Goodacre is arguing is that this event has happened already. And that is the reason why the prophecy is in the text. Prophecy is put into texts like these by the authors because the events have already happened. Keep that in mind as we go further in this analysis.
That's the function of that prophecy. And what happens a lot with New Testament scholars is that they get caught up in this idea of, well, could Jesus really prophesy or not? That's not the question. The question is, what's the function of the prophecy in the text? And what it's doing is for people who are hearing Matthew's gospel, let's say, in Syria somewhere, and they go, oh my goodness, did Jesus prophesy that? And, you know, people hearing Luke's gospel in Corinth, and they're going, oh, it turns out that Jesus prophesied that. Did you? Oh, wow. You know, so it's a legitimizing role. So Mark, I think, because of the fall of Jerusalem and other things as well, he writes this gospel, which is kind of triggered by the events of 66 to 70. And this is such a profoundly traumatic event for Jews in this period that's what it kind of pushes, that's what it kind of leads to.
Okay, so we're being told by a religious scholar here, a renowned one at that, Professor Mark Goodacre, that when we see prophecy in religious texts, in these gospel texts, it's in there because these events have already happened. And so we go back to our original charge here, our original question here, which is, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? And we turn back to the prophecy texts, certainly alleged prophecy texts that we discussed earlier, and then we ask ourselves, we say, look, these are in here, these are prophecies, and so we should assume that if we see them in our text, then according to our religious scholar here, these events should have already happened, right? That's the assumption. Okay, let's continue.
a conversation of, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? You did a response that I thought it was really, really good.
All right, let's see it.
So the basic argument is Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. And people go to those verses where Jesus says, some standing here will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming with the kingdom.
Some people believe he is saying that the disciples here will not die until I come back for the second time.
Yeah, people go, well, Jesus predicted that generation, the people he was talking to, are going to see the second coming. It hasn't happened, therefore he was wrong.
That is the plain sense of the text, and I would argue that it is the consensus view that the Olivet Discourse represents Jesus' second coming as anticipated within a single generation. And I would also argue that folks who offer alternative interpretations are motivated primarily by dogmatism, and specifically by the need to sidestep the plain sense of a text that would otherwise seem to undermine the inspiration, the inerrancy, the univocality of the Bible.
And so you go,
all right, folks. So now we have religious studies scholar Dr. Dan McClellan, who is responding to I think a YouTube clip, or maybe it's another social media clip, regarding the issue of whether or not Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, and he's pointing to the verses that we've been discussing here in this video. And his position is that the plain reading of the text is that this is a failed prophecy. It's the plain reading. There's no other reading permitted. In fact, he goes on to cast aspersions against those who would suggest any other reading from this. So the position is, this is in the text, it is a prophecy, and it is a failed prophecy. So now you're asking yourselves, well, wait a second. I thought we were just told that the reason why a writer would put a prophecy in the text in the first place is because the events have already happened. But yet here we're being told that this text is being put in because the event hasn't happened. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more, but when we talk about religious studies scholars consensus, when we talk about the expertise needed in the field to understand these arguments, I go back to the question of what expertise is needed in order to recognize that there's a clear disconnect here between two different religious scholars and the framing of what should otherwise be a very simple issue. And let's go one step further. All right, so recall, with respect to the temple prophecies, the alleged temple prophecies, the actual discussion of the destruction of the temple is not in Mark, Matthew, or Luke. It's not in there. Again, we've discussed this in other videos. It's not there. And so we're told the reason why those alleged prophecies were put in the text is because the events have already happened. But we're also told that despite the fact that those events having happened is not mentioned in the text, we're supposed to read it in that it's there, because the only reason they'd be there is because the events happened. But now we're here with these passages that are also labeled as prophecy. And in these, I'm able to read these at least as potentially indicating that the event that's being described here actually has happened, and I'm seeing it in the text. And let's just start with Mark and just look at that. And all three passages are similar in this regard. So Mark says, immediately after the prophecy line in Mark 9:1, we have Mark 9:2, which says, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and brought them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And then verse 3, and his garments became radiant and exceedingly white, as no launder on earth can whiten them. And then verse 4, Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. All right, so that is Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 4. And again, I could be a moron. I'm not a religious scholar, probably an idiot. But for me, when I read that, I can easily read that as saying, hey, this is following every single reference to this in all three of the synoptic gospels falls with this exact event. Perhaps when Jesus is saying, see, the kingdom of God has come, after it has come with power, perhaps this is it. Perhaps this is this event that happens right afterwards is that event. Now, again, I'm not a religious scholar. There's others who look at this and they may say that's not. You can't read it that way. You know, if you read it that way, you have another agenda. You're denying the plain reading. You clearly have some other agenda, dishonest agenda, because the plain reading suggests otherwise. But here I am, simpleton me. I come and I look at this and I say, right after this text, in all three gospels, this pretty spectacular event, the transfiguration, takes place, and it seems to be connected directly to the verse preceding it. I'm required to ignore that and say that's not there. But then I'm supposed to read in the temple destruction. So we'll continue discussing this as we move through with the rest of this analysis, but just keep this in mind as we proceed.
And so you go, what do you do with this? Well, some scholars have said, well, let's take a step back here. Are we even understanding prophecy right?
So this is just the first hermeneutic step in trying to find an alternative to the plain sense of the text, because you cannot accept the plain sense of the text.
So yeah, it's pretty clear. I can't have another interpretation other than this so-called plain meaning that this is obviously a failed prophecy. This prophecy was put in here. It clearly could not have happened. It didn't happen. It was put in here anyway, despite what we were told about prophecies being included in texts like these. And if I try to argue anything else, if I try to argue any other thing, I have an agenda. It's me. It's not him. It's not Dan McClellan. It's not anyone else. It's me who has the agenda. If I try to read this and say, maybe it's just what they're doing here is what Jesus was talking about here was a transfiguration, and maybe any other number of things. Again, I really, truly, not the right person to do exegesis on passages like these. But I can tell you, as someone who reads these as a believer, there was nothing in these texts that jumps off the page to me that says you're not permitted to read it the way I've described, which is that the event that Jesus is talking about here is the event that comes right after it. Okay, but be that as it may, you want to quibble with that. I know some people they're pissed off right now and their pitchforks are out because they think I'm trying to pull a fast one here. All right, if that's what you think, that's fine. But there is an obvious other implication here. Okay. And it goes to this was put in and it's a failed prophecy. And so that obviously means, right? I think it should be obvious to all of us, right? Again, just on the plain analysis without doing any shenanigans. It obviously means that these texts were written fairly early, right? Because if the writers are going to put in a prophecy that they know has already failed, that wouldn't make any sense, right? I think we'd all agree on that. So no writer would write these texts. And remember, the entire way we're supposed to look at the Gospels is we're supposed to assume that these are written as fictitious accounts. That's the assumption we're all supposed to take. That someone sat down and decided, I want to write some fiction today. Okay, so we're entertaining that. We're accepting that argument for the purposes of our discussion here. And so we're being told, yep, this is a failed prophecy, and so it didn't happen. And so the at least to me, again, with my simple brain, the obvious implication from that is that, okay, this must be fairly early. This must have been written at a time when the potential people who this could have been referring to, the apostles, the disciples, would have still been alive, because if it was written later, it wouldn't make any sense, right? I mean, am I missing something by that implication? Well, let's see what scholars say. All right.
On our chat here. Okay, Michael E. Hello, good to see you. So just some quick background on these on these Sunday sessions. So the reason I haven't been able to do these AMA sessions is because I've been teaching the live version of this course. So there will be a new masterclass live course that I'm going to start in August. So it's going to be the kind of continuation of the gospel stuff. So stay tuned for that. It's called The Myth of the Apostles. The Myth of the Apostles.
Okay, again, this is Dr. David Litwa. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Also a religious studies scholar. Obviously, he has a course here. I actually had to include this snippet up front before we get into the meat of his issue. For a couple reasons. One is, obviously he's offering a course. I'm the one who has the agenda. We're the ones who have the agenda for here, and not them, right? So just leave that there. But the second part is the course that's going to be coming up is entitled "The Myth of the Apostles," right? So this is all myth. This is all nonsense. It's just made up. It's fiction, etc. Okay, fine. Again, that's their position. But we're going to be told here about dating, and that's why I've included this snippet.
Of the Apostles. The Myth of the Apostles. Okay. Just going to go through the comments. Let's see here. We've got, again, if I miss any kind of questions, just retype them in the chat. Okay, Mercurius. So is Dr. L basically saying that the Gospels are from 2nd or 3rd century? Well, the model is that we have date ranges, and if you take the course, you'll see that I accept a kind of wave model. So I don't absolutely deny that any kind of memories and traditions might go back to the 1st century. But I think that, yes, when we're talking about final products, we are every single one of the Gospels is a 2nd century product. I think that can be demonstrated. Absolutely. Let's see, Lord.
Okay. All right, guys. Look, I'm not going to be kind here. Okay, this doesn't deserve that. We're being told now that every gospel is a 2nd century creation. The final products are all 2nd century. Everyone, Mark, Matthew, Luke, all of them, John, 2nd century. And this isn't, there's no agenda here. This professor has no agenda. It's just telling the facts. He's just calling balls and strikes. There's no agenda here. This is a religious scholar. This is these are the people. They analyze the subject matter with rigor. It's only the evangelicals and the cuckoos and everything else that the Bible thumpers that says all the other, that believes any of this is real and believes that any of this is history. Not them. They have no agenda. All right. So let's look at what we're being told here. Every one of the Gospels was written in the 2nd century. So that means the prophecies that we looked at, the failed prophecies, right? The alleged failed prophecies, Mark chapter 9, Luke chapter 9, etc. That these were put in there by the writer who's writing fiction, prophesying that Jesus would come before the end of the generation of people who died an entire generation previously. Guys, this doesn't make any sense. And this is what I mean when I say there's no reason for us to grant any of this without challenge. None of it. Absolutely none of it is entitled to any deference. Enough. This is crap. None of this makes any sense. Okay, there's no reason for us to give any deference to these people when they make their claims. We must scrutinize everything they say, because now we're being told on the same record by people who presumably studied the same material and are in the same field, the experts, And now we're being told these documents are written in the 2nd century. Every single person who could have been referred to in these prophecies would have been long deceased by then. So that means that the writer who wrote those prophecies knowing that they were failed? That's what we're supposed to believe? But remember, we were told that prophecies are put in because the events have already happened. Guys, this does not make any sense. It's not reconcilable. And we don't owe them deference when they give us crap like this. I know I sound emotional on this, but this is nonsense. And I could do this all day on almost any. I could go through authorship. I can go through dating. I can go through analysis of history. I can go through resurrection accounts. We can go through any of it and find this same kind of nonsense. So look, if I'm supposed to understand something as an expert and I'm not getting it, that's one thing. But then I should see that consistency, that pattern. I should see when the experts come and line up and talk about this stuff, I should see some pattern of consistency on how this stuff is analyzed. If they're not consistent, if they don't have a consistent position, then there's no reason for us to accept any concept from them as being universal or truthful. It's this kind of stuff, and the reason why I'm so fired up about this is because if you're just a casual consumer of this, you're just scrolling through YouTube, doing your thing, watching some sports, watching some other stuff, and then you come across some Christian channels, some skeptical channels, some atheist channels, and you see these religious scholars that you respect, and you see them talking, and you hear this. You may not digest it all in one sit down. You hear this stuff. You're entitled to accept it. You should believe it because these are the experts, and it's total nonsense. And so, how is someone who's really trying to understand this, who's really, trying to figure out, do I want to embark down this pathway or not? How is that person supposed to have a chance when they're being fed absolute rubbish like this? So that's a question for us here, and it circles us back to the original question. We're told that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. We have to believe that. If we argue something else, we have an agenda. And yet it doesn't fit with any of the other things that the so-called experts told us we're supposed to believe.
If you just keep it oral, you just say, oh, well, maybe we just kind of misremembered it, or maybe, we should put this emphasis on. But as soon as you've written down, some of those standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power, like Mark has in 9:1. Once that's written down, then you are compelled to find a way of reinterpreting that, right?
Right.
And one of the most fascinating attempts to reinterpret this is in John 21, where you've got this situation where the entire narrative presupposes that all the disciples are dead. That's why John's gospel can't possibly be early. It's presupposing that they're all dead.
And this works into your thesis that
Right.
John knows the other.
Right, absolutely, because John is trying to address this awful problem of the idea that the disciples, at least maybe one would still be alive by the end, and then they've all gone. And you get this amazing story where you get this attempt to kind of what Jesus actually said was this, not this, and so you get this sort of, and this is what happens. That's the problem with literary works, because as soon as you commit something to writing, you are then binding the hands of somebody in the future who's going, oh shoot, it actually didn't happen that way. Do you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
You see this, folks? Do you see this? So we're told now that once this stuff is written down, it's binding on the future writers who will have to come and clean it up. And so that alone should suggest that it would be preposterous to argue a 2nd century date for any of this. Okay, but be that as it may, even with Professor Goodacre, there's a problem here because we're being told that the prophecy is put in because the event has already happened. But there's a clear problem from his own statements, because here the prophecy is put in and it hasn't happened according to him. I mean, he's telling us that. And so it's John who comes later and has to clean this up, as we're being told, because the earlier writers messed it up. But the problem with that is that even according to Professor Goodacre's dating, which dates Mark at 70, Matthew somewhere in the 80s, and Luke according to Professor Goodacre, at the turn of the 2nd century, Luke has this passage in his gospel. Professor Goodacre says he's now come to believe that Luke may have been influenced by Josephus, and he places Luke now at early 2nd century as a result of that. It's someone pointed out to me in the comments, and it's a snippet that I cut out of a different video. Professor Goodacre has actually updated his earlier position on this with respect to Josephus, and now accepts a 2nd century date for Luke, who has this prophetic passage in his gospel. And Professor Goodacre himself told us that those don't go in when the writer doesn't already know that the event has happened. We're told by Dan McClellan that the event failed. The event didn't happen, and you can't read it any other way. And now, with a 2nd century date for Luke, Professor Goodacre still wants us to hold both positions at the same time. We do not have to credit that. We don't, and we shouldn't. And in fact, it's not the intellectually honest way to go about this work. We're not required to hold two irreconcilable positions at the same time. Two irreconcilable positions at the same time. We're not required to do that. Asking that from us is unfair. So we're not going to do it. This channel's not doing that. Just so I'm fair to Professor Goodacre, let me add the passage in about his dating of Luke.
Specifically. So when do you date Matthew and Luke?
I, for simplicity's sake, because we don't know, right, but for simplicity's sake, I go Mark 70s, Matthew 80s, Luke. Do you know what? I used to say Luke 90s, but I've recently become convinced by Steve Mason's argument that Luke knows Josephus. I'd in the past, I'd always put, so I think Luke, actually, we're going to have to put him into the early 2nd century.
Wow.
I think it's Steve Mason, the book is called Josephus in the New Testament. Just a fantastic book.
All right, that's fine. So what we should see next is that, at least with respect to Luke, okay, we'll set aside Matthew for now. We'll stretch that there potentially could have been one surviving apostle per Professor Goodacre's point of view in the 80s, in the late 80s. So we'll set aside Matthew and we'll go with Luke, who Professor Goodacre has now become convinced is in the early part of the 2nd century. And so the assumption must be then, right? The analysis must be, per Professor Goodacre, that Luke would not include a prophecy that Luke would have known, the writer of Luke would have known at the time of writing, which here now is in the early 2nd century, has failed. That writer would not include a prophecy that they knew to have failed. So let's see.
Happen that way. Do you know what I mean? So,
yes.
So I think that's the issue that you get, because it must have been dramatic and traumatic, and in a way, for a lot of the members of the Jesus movement, kind of exhilarating when they thought, oh my goodness, the temple has been destroyed. Didn't we hear something about Jesus predicting? And they start filtering the events through through their own tradition. And you can just see, I think, in Mark's gospel, the excitement almost. I mean, it's an awful word to use because it was such a profoundly traumatic event, and that trauma is there as well in Mark. But it's almost the excitement of, this thing we've just witnessed, that's what Jesus was talking about. And, function of prophecy, I think, in all these texts, it's basically, it has a literary function, and the literary function is Jesus was right. Jesus was who he said he was.
Right.
That's why we're giving you this prophecy, which we have seen fulfilled. It only has that impact if the reader is thinking, wow, this has happened.
Right.
Okay, so let's go back to the original question for this video, and that is, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? The answer, according to Professor Goodacre, is clearly no. It's an absolute no. Professor Goodacre's own analysis rejects it clearly, because we're told by Dan McClellan and other scholars that the prophecy in Matthew chapter 16 and in Mark chapter 9 and Luke chapter 9, it failed. It's a failed prophecy. That's the argument. We're told that's a failed prophecy. Well, we know that can't be right, because the writer of Luke, who wrote at the turn of the 2nd century, could not have included a prophecy that writer would have known at that time had failed. So Professor Goodacre has answered the question for us. Jesus could not have been a failed apocalyptic leader. That we're not allowed to reach that analysis if we follow the logic of Professor Goodacre. Is everyone on board with that? Okay, great. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up here fairly shortly. It speaks for itself at this point. You guys see this. We're told there's a literary function for including prophecy. Professor Goodacre is telling us that, and he told us the function. It's so that the reader can say, wow, look at what Jesus predicted. But that function only holds where the event has already come true. Yet here we are again, in the same breath, in the same interview, from the same scholar, and we've looked at the references from other scholars, putting Luke well past the time where the prophecy of Luke chapter 9 could have actually come true. The writer of Luke chapter 9, if writing in the 2nd century, would have known, if that prophecy was meant the way Dan McClellan told us we're supposed to read it, that writer would have known that could not be true. And according to Professor Goodacre, it would not have been included. So what are we supposed to make of this, folks? What are we supposed to do now? Because we're being told all different kinds of things here, and we're being told this from the experts. And so I'm being asked, what's your background? What basis do you have? What credentials do you have in order for you to question these people who've dedicated their lives to this? And I'm saying, look, I'm the fact finder here. I'm the person here who's being given the evidence, and I'm just trying to make of it what I can. And it's not my burden to do more than that. If there's something that I'm missing, you're supposed to tell me. You, the expert, is supposed to tell me how there's a reason why the stuff I'm looking at is wrong, or there's a reason why I'm looking at it incorrectly. But here we are, the positions that we're being told to hold, the simultaneous issues that we're being told to hold, don't add up. They can't be held simultaneously. There's a cognitive dissonance taking place. And it doesn't just apply to this issue. We're told that the Gospels circulated anonymously for decades. No one knew who wrote them, but yet they were still copying them, making copies, treating them as authoritative, reading them at congregations without having any idea where they came from. Just, hey, God, today we're going to read a story. It's an anonymous author. We don't know who wrote it. It has to do with this guy. His name was Jesus or something, the other. And we're going to talk about it, and we're going to worship around this. No one had any idea. Even Luke's gospel, which has a benefactor named at the front, or presumed benefactor, no one had any idea who's writing this. We're told this. And if we argue otherwise, we have the agenda. We're told that it's impossible that the Gospel of Matthew was first. But yet the evidence that we have, the only evidence that we have that we can look at says otherwise, uniformly, with no one ever saying Mark was first. No one in antiquity. We're told that the dating of the Gospels is based on all different kinds of things. Some people it's temple prophecies. Some people it's poll tax. It's Josephus. It's 70s. It's 200s. It's all over the place. Some of the dating pushes the writing of the Gospels past the point where we have historians who are already writing about them. We're told this. When Professor Litwa says all of these are second century, we have Papias at the end of the first century writing about Matthew and Mark. Now we're supposed to say, those weren't the Gospels. Okay, you just those names, yeah, but that's not the Gospels. We have Justin Martyr. We have Muratorian fragment. We have Irenaeus. We have Clement of Alexandria, 2nd century, Tatian. But we cannot. Nope. This is all with smug assuredness that's right. We're being told this. So I know I am charged up. I know I'm sounding fired up about this. I am going to wrap this up, but I want to conclude on this point. When you hear that there is scholarly consensus, historians have reached consensus. The overwhelming majority of scholars in the field say X or Y. When you hear that, your antenna should go up. It's the biggest tell that there's something wrong. Because when there's evidence, we will get that instead. When they don't have that, we get consensus, and we get all the historians believe this. This issue today is the question of whether Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. I think it's just a nonsense argument. It's nonsense. There's no reason why we have to accept that. But even if we did, the case for it struggles, given all of the other assumptions we're supposed to take. So I'll close off here. We do not owe anyone in this field. We don't owe it in any field, but we don't owe anyone in this field specifically, the one we're focused on, religious studies, biblical studies, religious scholarship, any deference, any benefit of the doubt. Every single statement that they give us must be scrutinized and challenged. They must show us the evidence for where they got it, and we have a right to scrutinize it. And if all we get is consensus, red flags. Hey, got something? Nope. That's not going to work. You got to give us the evidence. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here, guys. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was illustrative. And thanks for your time.